Wilderness Lady by John W. Buckner, 1980, Chapter 1, The Beginning. Crossett, Arkansas was founded at the turn of the 19th century in Quapaw Territory in Ashley County. As the Indians left their habitat, settlers from the old states came in and settled along Saline and Ouachita Rivers, on the ridges and creeks, and in the prairies where the water was plentiful and the timber was not so huge. Subsistence farming, along with fishing and hunting, provided the livelihood of these early settlers. 100 years later, 3 families furnished most of the leadership and capital for the establishment of the Crossett Lumber Company, which located in the midst of a great pine forest, miles distance from a railroad, highway, or navigable stream. Cap Gates, the first manager of the company, conceived the idea of an important sawmill operation and enlisted the aid of his brothers, along with E.S. Crossett and J.W. Watzek, and small investors, and the operation was begun with capital of $500,000 and 100,000 acres of timber. Success of the adventure was assured in a short time by the wise management of Cap Gates and the board of directors. A town grew up as the mill progressed, and more workers came in. By 1912, 3 rail lines reached Crossett, and the company built their own line to Monticello. In the late 20s, a charcoal plant was built, and the first paper mill began operation in 1936. Other paper mills, a chemical laboratory, a particle board plant, and other industries were added until the properties reached a value of over $125 million by 1963. Presently, and this is 1980, properties are worth in excess of $275 million. The first managers of the Crossett Lumber Company were but stern men who allowed no distracting influences or persons in the company town. Labor trouble in the early years was almost unknown, but when the first paper mill began operations, workers demanded, and only after prolonged strife received, affiliation with the labor movement. Another strike at the sawmill produced difficulty, but adjustment to the needs and desires of labor by the company has been productive of peace for the most part. Reforestation and logging have been important aspects of the Crossett industries. From the beginning, the company protected young trees, but a reforestation program was formally established in 1919. Since then, logging and reforestation have developed together, with the forestry department having complete charge of logging operations. Both have been completely modernized, and the forestry department has developed one of the finest reforestation procedures in the nation. The town built by the Crossett Lumber Company has survived while most other small towns have died. The town and industry of Crossett have survived because of men with vision who do not wish the forest to die. Near maximum development of wood product industries that paid good wages, and the Bartholomew Plan of town development. Crossett, as a town and an industry, continues to grow and attract the attention of enterprising industrialists. The original force behind the establishment of the Crossett Lumber Company was Edgar Woodward Gates, Cap Gates, as he was later became known to his associates. He went to Colorado as a youth and became a miner. He worked as a common laborer until an explosion caused him the sight in one eye and most of the vision in the other. Gates then returned to his home in Ohio and did odd jobs for a year or 2. He later joined his 2 brothers who were in the sawmill business at Thornton, Arkansas. Cap Gates went to work cutting logs, but in a short time he became manager of the mill and developed a plan to establish a great sawmill operation. He was ambitious to prove his ability to his brothers and to himself. Gates said years later, "So far I am concerned, Crossett, was born of my restlessness and eagerness to prove myself. Gates learned of a tract of land, 50,000 acres in Ashton County, Arkansas, and Morehouse Parish, Louisiana. Because he was practically without funds, the purchase presented a difficult problem for him, but with little help of a cousin, he borrowed enough money to take an option on the huge tract of land. The next step for Cap Gates was to interest responsible lumbermen to provide the capital to establish a large sawmill operation. He turned to his employers, E.S. Crossett, Dr. J.W. Watzek, and his three brothers, P.G., Albert, and C.W. Gates. He proposed that they buy the tract of land on which he had an option and also purchase other adjoining lands and form a new company. His proposal met the approval of his associates, and the timberlands were purchased. These men became the principal stockholders of the Crossett Lumber Company. The minute book in the offices of Georgia Pacific Corporation, successors of the Crossett Company, carries the following statement in handwriting of E. W. Gates. The stockholders of the Crossett Lumber Company meet in the office of J.N.O. B. Jones at 10 a.m. May 16, 1899, in pursuance of the contract signed by the stockholders, and organize the stockholders' meeting in pursuant of the written agreement signed by each. At the meeting of the stockholders, the Crossett Lumber Company issued 16,000 shares of stock. E.S. Crossett and C.W. Gates each invested $100,000 and became the major stockholders of the newly established firm. Cap Gates contributed $12,000 and J.C. Northcutt $2,000. 15 other individuals invested sums ranging from $1,000 to $100,000. Capitalization of the young firm totaled $400,000. Dr. J.W. Watzek, E.S. Crossett's physician, living then in Davenport, Iowa, was persuaded by his patient to enter the Crossett venture. Dr. Watzek became a member of the board of the directors, and his son, John, was for a time manager of the Crossett operations after retirement of Cap Gates. Dr. Watzek's grandson, Peter, was the last president of the Crossett Company. The company board, at its first official meeting, approved the purchase from Hovey and McCracken of Muskogee, Michigan, of 50,000 acres for $7 per acre, located in Ashton County, Arkansas, and Morehouse Parish, Louisiana. A down payment of $50,000 on the timberland was made, with the remaining amount to be paid over a period of 7 years. Except for Dr. Watzek, all the major stockholders had previous experience in the lumber business and other enterprises. The Crossett brothers from Davenport, Iowa, had been previously active in lumbering at Thornton, Fordyce, and Wilmer, Arkansas. The Gates brothers were also experienced lumbermen. Charlie Gates, oldest of the brothers, managed the Fordyce Lumber Company, later identified with Crossett, and was active until his retirement. Cap Gates, the youngest of the brothers, had no experience in the lumber business until he went to Thornton, where he soon became manager of the mill. Permanent officers from among these men were C.W. Gates, president; E.S. Crossett, vice president; J.W. Watzek, treasurer; E.W. Gates, secretary; and H.G. Rule, assistant secretary. During the early years of the company's operations, it was mainly a producer of lumber and staves, and it also purchased and sold lumber produced by other nearby mills. The scope of operations was similar in nature to other large mills in the first years of the 19th century. Tram roads, machine shops, and other facilities for the production of lumber for a national market were erected by the Crossett Company. Cap Gates, the moving spirit in the organization of the enterprise, wanted to be a manager of a new company, as the directors discussed one man after another for the position. Cap Gates fidgeted in his chair, fearing that they would never get around to asking him. After discarding name after name, one of the directors turned to him and asked, "What about you?" Gates instantly replied, "I'm willing to take this job, all right, Mr. Crossett, and I believe I can make a go of it." Cap Gates' first objective to ensure an operation of at least 20 years was to add to the 50,000 acres as much additional land as possible before beginning. He opened a land office adjacent to the company holdings at Hamburg, the county seat of Ashley County. This office, located in the back of a barber shop on Main Street, conducted business day and night. People eager to dispose of what they considered worthless timber kept the office busy. Gates built a plank walk from the street around to the office, which was frequently lined with eager sellers. Gates told of one incident that reveals the attitude of many farmers. He heard a voice out in the street call, "Hey, Bill, sold your pine timber yet?" The man addressed replied, "No," the first caller said. "Well, you better come on and get rid of it before this damned fool's money runs out." Bill very likely did sell, for Cap Gates bought another 50,000 acres of timber by the end of the year. The directors of the company believed 100,000 of timber to be sufficient for a 20-year mill operation. After the best timber on the 100,000 acres of land had been cut, they expected to close operations and leave the countryside a barren wasteland. Few lumbermen foresaw the possibility of reforestation and the industries that would ultimately consume second-growth timber. Hamburg, the county seat, was the logical location for the new sawmill. It was already a stable town, with a railroad, the Mississippi, Hamburg and Western, which connected with the Missouri Pacific near Greenville, Mississippi. Hamburg also had a well-developed business section and a mill of its own. A wagon road extended from the town to the Ouachita River at Marie Saline, and a north-south road ran through Hamburg from Monticello, Arkansas to Bastrop, Louisiana. Although none of these roads were graded and well-drained, they did provide the means of communication necessary for a large sawmill operation. Cap Gates and the directors actually planned to erect their mill at the company seat if an adequate building site could be obtained. The Weekly Eagle of Hamburg on May 5, 1901 stated, "They, the Crossett Lumber Company, have slated Hamburg for the seat of their manufacturing operations." And the same date the Eagle stated, quote, "The Crossett Lumber Company, whose headquarters are at Hamburg, will construct between 35 and 40 miles of railroad," unquote. However, when the Crossett Company made definite plans to locate the mill at Hamburg, they found it impossible to secure land and the consent of the leading citizens. The civic leaders of Hamburg decided they did not want an additional sawmill and refused to sell a location for the mill. Though protection for their native sawmill may have been the motives, as some believe, two reasons were given for their refusal. They did not want the mill to hire their quote-unquote Negroes and felt foreign sawmill people in their town would be undesirable. A.C. Moncrief Sr., an employee of the Crossett Company from 1903 until retirement, said Hamburg would not have the mill. Crossett Irwin, also formerly employed by the Crossett Company as transportation superintendent, said, quote, "The old codgers at Hamburg are directly responsible for the town of Crossett. They would not even sell the company the land for the mill site. Cap Gates told them to go to hell. He would build his own town," unquote. Cap Gates then selected a site for the new mill 2 miles from the nearest post office, 13 miles from the county seat, and in the midst of a virgin forest. Moncrief said there were trees there, 4 and 5 feet in diameter, where Crossett built its first houses. Without river transportation or roads available, nor even a nearby creek, the mill was built in a remote section inhabited by a few subsistence farmers. Only the growing of cattle and swine disturbed the silence of the primeval wilderness. Before the big mill, a small plant was erected to cut the lumber for mill sheds and homes. In May of 1899, machinery for the larger mill was hauled on sleds because of the lack of roads and the continual rains. When the sawmill was being constructed, the employees lived in tents either brought in by themselves or provided by the company. Naturally, the first lumber cut was used to build houses, neither uniform in size nor shape. They were built of 1x10 planks nailed vertically to bracing with 1x4 strips used to seal cracks. Most of the wood lumber, the houses, though crude, were of excellent quality. Later, a school, churches, and mill sheds were constructed of very similar material. Cap Gates, the moving and controlling spirit in the operation, ran the town like a plantation. Everyone soon knew that Crossett was a one-man town and that Cap Gates was that man. The first railroad built in Crossett in 1902. The first lumber moved over it the same year. In 1908, the Rock Island Railroad reached Crossett, adding greatly to the convenience and the growth of the new town and the industry. It is interesting to note that 140 convicts in ball and chain worked on the road. The Crossett Mill was one of the most modern in the South for its time. According to E.T. Allen, an employee in many capacities and finally office manager of the company, the number one pine mill was a band mill with edgers and trimmers. Circle saws trimmed the log, which was then sawn into lumber by the bandsaw. Because of smoother cut, the number one band mill manufactured superior lumber to the number two mill. The number two mill was used circle saws for trimming logs and a band and a huge gang saw. The gang saw got its name for its ability to saw a huge log or several small ones in a single operation. The logs were placed on a power carriage which carried them into the saws. The gang saw was set at 1, 2, or 3 inches depending on the desired thickness of boards needed. The carriage then moved the logs, often 3 or more small ones at a time, into the saws which moved through them and left a pile of lumber. The lumber was then carried away by a power chain and stacked for the kilns by an automatic stacker. The pine mills cut almost every kind of lumber, but a large portion of the output was of dimensions 4x8, 2x4, and 12x12, used by the building industry. For many years, these mills produced excellent pine flooring and every type of molding without knots or discoloration, showing clearly the grain of the tree. Center match, used primarily for sheathing in roofs and sides of buildings, was produced in all grades. Beaded ceiling was another prime product of superior trees. Timbers were produced for various types of heavy manufactures such as large buildings, trestles, and bridges. They were sawed in large dimensions such as 6x8, 6x12, and even larger. The hardwood mill, built soon after the pine mills, was never a prime source of income from the Crossett Lumber Company or employment for workers. It was important because large stands of fine hardwood timber owned by the company. The main product of the hardwood mill was oak, pecan, and gum flooring. The oak flooring came from the very heart of the log where the grain was clear and free from any sort of blemish. From the best of the oak timber also came fine molding of every variety. The poorest grades of hardwood timber were used in making pallets and later charcoal and chemical products such as alcohol, tars, and acids. The yards of the mill for production, drying, and storage covered 124 acres with modern dry kilns operated by steam to completely cure all lumber. Manufacturing shops for auxiliary products such as mop handles and pallets were included in the complex. The tallest smokestack in the South, painted gray, stood almost in the center of the sawmill area. When the mills began operations, everything was done by hand except the actual cutting of lumber. Huge runways extended to every area of the yard. Mules were used to pull carts loaded with lumber to the storage area where the products were stacked and air-dried. Oak was stacked and cured from 90 days to 6 months or longer, but pine was dried in the kilns as quickly as possible. Intense heat and steam-heated kilns removed quickly all the moisture from the pine lumber. Stacking lumber, a slow process, was done entirely by hand, necessitating the construction of high wooden trams to all parts of the mill yard. In the 1940s came semi-automatic machines that stacked lumber much faster than can be done by hand. A few years later, an improved machine automatically stacked the lumber as it was conveyed by chain from the mill. The forklift was capable of propelling a whole stack of lumber to any desired height. The Ross carrier simply straddled the stack of lumber, raised it, and transported it to the desired location. The coming of the forklift and the Ross carrier made high trims unnecessary, and graveled or blacktop roads replaced them over the mill yards. The box factory, established in 1916, used much of the inferior material. The poor grades of lumber were resawed into half-inch sizes or less and used to make crates and boxes. Some of the crates were completed, but most of the half-inch strips were shipped unassembled to purchasers. John H. Allen says that a few of the pallets and boxes were used locally, but most were shipped to many parts of the nation. The box factory was discontinued with the advent of paper boxes and crates, and the inferior lumber was then used by paper mills and the chemical plant. Another byproduct of the sawmills was paper plugs for rolls of paper. These plugs were made largely from planer mill shavings, ground up, glued, and pressed together under great pressure and heat. Paper mills provided a market for plugs the Crossett industries were unable to use. Mop handles were manufactured for many years from the edgings of the lumber manufactured from inferior materials. Few handles were completely assembled by Crossett. Blanks from which mop handles were made were shipped unfinished to the consumer. The only purpose for manufacturing mop handles was to utilize waste of inferior materials. Most mop handles were sold to manufacturers in Monticello, Arkansas, and in Mississippi. This was never a major operation of the industry, but it produced an annual income of slightly over $4,000. In contract with the Crossett Company, treated lumber was produced by Copper's Company and sold to material dealers. There were two kinds of treated lumber, womanized and creosoted. The womanized was treated under high pressure by a Woolman salts process and rendered permanently resistant to insect invasion. It was used primarily for foundations and posts and other timbers that might come in contact with the ground or dampness. Creosoted lumber was treated primarily for indefinite preservation and lasted many times longer than untreated timbers. Creosoted timbers were widely used for poles, piling, bridge timbers, and cross ties. The expansion of the company and the need for additional transportation facilities to reach outside markets led the company to construct the Ashley, Drew, and Northern Railroad in 1912 with 25 stockholders holding 24,000 shares of stock. The new railroad was an independent auxiliary, but the stock was owned by personnel of the company and was in the business of originating freight. It extended from Crossett to Monticello, a distance of approximately 45 miles. The new railroad, the fourth terminated in Crossett, gave the company an advantage in freight rates since it originated and switched its own commerce. The Ashley, Drew, and Northern Railroad in 1937 originated 10,000 cars of freight, terminated 4,000 cars, and handled 2,000 cars of overhead business. A person could then come to Crossett over 4 railroads, but could not go through the town to any other destination. This situation still exists. The later growth of the Crossett Lumber Company into a complex of many related companies called the Crossett Companies was due to the same factors that made this spectacular early development possible. Wise but stern management by resident managers like Cap Gates and Peter Watzek, along with the board of directors who interfered as little as possible with a good local team, led the young company into an enviable position with among forest products producers. During the early years, the Crossett Company considered cutover lands valueless for producing a second growth of timber. Like others, managers of the company sought to develop farms and livestock raising on denuded timberlands. As other lumbermen were doing, experimental farms were developed, and agents of the company introduced new crops, crop rotation, and use of commercial fertilizers. Yet, despite heroic efforts and the expenditure of considerable sums, farming ventures were unsuccessful. For the most part of the thin pine land soils proved unsuitable for profitable farming. Reluctantly, perhaps, the owners of the Crossett Company concluded that their cutover lands were worthless except for the purpose intended by nature. In time, a gigantic industry undreamed of by lumbermen was to be based on young pines growing on lands largely worthless for the production of agricultural products.